three less things up here. Well, turn on the microphone. I see the hands. Okay, all right. So, all right. So it is Independence Day weekend, and I hope you have a great time celebrating that tomorrow or even today if you're jumping the gun. But in the spirit of Independence Day, I wanted to share with you a meme that I came across this past week. It's this meme, and I know the words are small there. It says, "Become ungovernable." And you can see there it is a bird sitting on a sign that says, "No birds." So, and I thought that's an interesting phrase, become ungovernable. And so, what do you do today when you see something, that plucks your interest? You Google it to see what's behind that. It turns out that this is a whole set of memes. There's a whole series of memes. You can Google it yourself. Here's one. It says, "Become ungovernable." And it's a beaver chewing on a sign that says, "No feeding." And then my favorite was this. It's a dog holding a sign that says, "No dogs, please." So I think that the Patriots who threw the tea into Boston Harbor would smile at those memes. They might have more complicated reactions when it came to writing constitutions and so forth, but I think they would at least smile at the joke. And we can smile when we're thinking about the country and we're thinking about dogs with signs in their mouth. But the problem sometimes is that it's our own sign, and we're the dog. That we put up the sign because there's something we want to do, and we want to behave a particular way. We want to have a certain type of life, and yet we find that we don't do it. That we are ourselves ungovernable, even for the things where we want to be governed, where we've decided this is something I want to do. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because as I mentioned earlier, in a lot of ways, Christians aren't really any different than non-Christians. That if you look at a lot of different statistics, if you look at divorce or charitable giving or civic engagement in terms of voting or registration to vote or going to community meetings, if you look at personal debt, there's a lot of different ways where Christians are within a few percent of what non-Christians do, that our lives are really no different from the people around us. And so the question that as we consider this, as we ask the question, what if it's our own sign? What if we cannot do any better in living our own lives than the people around us? That we are to the same degree that their lives are governable, so are ours, at least taken as a group. And so that's the conversation we're going to have today. Now, if you're not a believer, if you're not a church person, if you're watching online, or if you're just not sure, somebody brought you here today, and you're not sure what you think about Christianity, that's okay. This message is not for you. And in fact, you may enjoy it. It may give you a reason. That's why I don't want to be a Christian, because you guys aren't any different, but you have to go to church and stuff like that. So I encourage you to sit and listen through this, because if nothing else, you will get some information you can use to make fun of your Christian friends. But it is a message that is aimed at us, and it comes to us from us who call ourselves Christians, who try to put into practice what Jesus teaches. And it comes to us from a document that was written in the first century, about 55 AD. It was written by a man named Paul, the Apostle Paul, we call him. And he was a leader in the early church, and it's called the Book of Romans. It's actually a letter. Paul wrote it to a church, and let's see if anyone remembers from last week. Where is that church located? Rome. All right. So, we got some real scholars here. So the letter that Paul wrote to the church in Rome, and in it, Paul says this. He says, "I know that the law is spiritual, but I'm made of flesh and blood, and sold as a slave to sin." Now, the question for that is what does he mean by slave? Because if you were here last week, or if you weren't, you can catch up online. But Paul said we've been set free from sin. That's been the course of his trajectory through Romans. He started by saying we've been set right with God, not because of the way we behave, or not even because of our pedigree, but because of what Jesus has done. And he says the way that Jesus set us free, the way Jesus set us right with God, also had the side effect of setting us free from sin. And yet here he is in chapter 7, he's saying, yeah, but I'm sold as a slave to sin. Well, what does he mean by that? Well, he goes on in verse 15 and he says, He says, reconnect. No, that's not what he says. So in 15, he says, I don't know what I'm doing because I don't do what I want to do. Instead, I do the thing that I hate. So he's saying, you may not technically be a slave. You know, in the Roman world, slavery was legal. 40% of the population was enslaved in different places. He's not saying you're legally a slave, but he's saying, you know what? If you do things you don't want to do, if you do things you disagree with, that's kind of like being a slave. So he's saying, you know, you figure it out, you know, do the math. Are you a slave? Now, you know, maybe nobody else can, you know, put you in chains or anything, but you're kind of already in chains. So he says, I don't do what I want to do. So in that sense, he says, I'm sold as a slave to sin. And so he says, that's the problem. So in chapter 6, he said we're set free. And in chapter 7, he says, yeah, but we're still kind of slaves. We're slaves to sin. And because that is such a troublesome idea, a lot of people, a lot of interpreters have said, well, Paul must be referring to the time before he started to follow Jesus. That once Jesus set him free, he didn't have any problems anymore. That he's referring back to his earlier life when he was still a sinner. So some people have interpreted it that way, but that's not the way most Christians have interpreted it down through the years. You know, no less a Christian than St. Augustine said, no, he's talking about his life as a Christian. The reformers, Martin Luther and John Calvin, said, no, he's talking about what it's like now. And in fact, even in the last century, the Presbyterian Church issued a confession called the Confession of 1967, and it said, the new life does not release a man from conflict with unbelief, pride, lust, and fear. He still has to struggle with disheartening difficulties and problems. So most Christians down through the centuries have said, yeah, I wish it was that easy. I wish that you know, when Christ set us free from sin, that we acted like we were free from sin. So what is Paul getting at here? And that's what he's going to talk about in the rest of this passage. So, and I think if I could summarize what Paul's going to say, he's going to say, pay attention to that tension, right? You're acting like a slave. You're doing the things that you don't want to do, right? So there's a part of you that says, I want to do this. And there's a part of you that says, yeah, but I'm helpless to do it. I can't not do the other thing. And he says, that tension, that's something you need to pay attention to. So he says, if I'm doing the thing that I don't want to do, I'm agreeing the law is right. That's, you know, I don't have any problem. You know, I really want to be that particular way. But he says, but now I'm not the one doing it anymore. Instead, it's sin that lives in me. So sin that lives in me. So what does he mean by that? He means that Christ has set us free from sin, and that sin no longer has any authority over us. But that doesn't mean sin went away. Sin is still there. Sin, and he locates sin. He says sin is still living inside you. So the first thing that Paul really says as we try to understand what he's saying in this passage, he says, sin has no authority over us, but it's not gone. Sin is still around. And that's where our problem starts. So he goes on in verse 18, he says, I know that good doesn't live in me, that is in my body. The desire to do good is inside of me, but I can't do it. I don't do the good that I want to do, but I do the evil that I don't want to do. But if I do the very thing that I don't want to do, then I'm not the one doing it anymore. Instead, it is sin that lives in me that is doing it. So, what is he saying here? He's saying that tension, the tension between the part of him that wants to do good and the part of him that is helpless, reveals the fact that sin is still at work. Now, what Paul is not doing, Paul's not shifting blame. He understands that wrong is wrong. You know, if you have an affair, then you are betraying your partner. If you rob a bank, both parts of you will go to jail. So Paul understands that. He's saying good intentions aren't enough, that ultimately it's what you do that matters. And you can say, well, you know, I want to do the good, but couldn't do it. Oh, well. No, Paul would not say that. He would say good intentions are not enough. And we might say indwelling sin is an insight. It's not an excuse. This is not, the devil made me do it, and so, nothing can be done about it. He says, no, this insight that you have this conflict going on inside you is helpful, but it's not an excuse for doing the things that we do. So he's about to explain something, and I need to give you a content warning, okay? He's going to use a metaphor. This is Paul's metaphor, not mine, and it's kind of gruesome, okay? Now, if you remember here, be advised. So, if you were here last week, you remember we talked about the metaphor for Paul, that we've been freed from sin. Because Paul was a first century Jew, the governing metaphor of his life would have been the Exodus, that God freed the people of God from their slavery in Egypt. So he would have thought of being freed from sin as being led out of Egypt, or last week we called it Sin City, because you want to leave behind the things that are characteristic of Egypt. You want to leave behind the sin when you come out of Egypt. When you come out of Sin City, what happened in Sin City should have stayed in Sin City. So we talked about it in terms of a location. And where Paul's going to come from in the next passages, he's going to say, and the problem is the location of Sin City is the entire world, the entire creation. It wasn't made that way. God made the world good. That God looked at what he had done and he declared that it was very good. And that includes the people that he made. That God made the world good. But something has gone wrong. The world has become polluted. Sin has entered the world and polluted it. It's like lead in the drinking water. It's corrupted us. In the same way, if you break your leg and it's not set properly, then the bones won't join properly together and you'll have a limp. He says that the world, all of creation and people have been kind of bent by sin. That like having, that sin is this pollution. So where is Sin City? Sin is the entire world, and sin is us. So that's his understanding of where is Egypt. We're not talking about the real Egypt that has a physical location. He's talking about where is Sin City? Where does sin actually reside? And so now he tells us what he means. He says, do you remember back in chapter 6 how Jesus freed you? The method that Jesus used to free us was by uniting us with him in his death and his resurrection. That we have union with Christ in his death. And so we are dead to sin and alive for God. So he says, but here's the problem. So I find that as a rule, when I want to do what is good, evil is right there with me. See, evil didn't go away, and neither did that dead body. That I have died in Christ, and I have a new birth, but the old me is lying there on the floor. And sin didn't leave it. Sin is still there. He says, I gladly agree with the law on the inside, but I see a different law at work in my body. It wages a war against the law of my mind, and it takes me prisoner with the law of sin that is in my body. This is a gruesome metaphor. Paul envisions that dead body still here and sin living in it. And the reason for that is Paul wants to expose sin. Watch TV today. What is sin? Sin is enticing. Sin is wicked. Sin is alluring, right? It's like the name of a perfume or something. Sin says no. Sin is disgusting. Sin is revolting. Sin is betrayal. Sin is deception. Sin is cowardice. It's arrogance. Sin is weakness. He says, sin is the reason your marriage failed. Sin is the reason they stole the money and ruined the relationship. Sin is why your parents were the way they were. Sin is why you gave up on that ambition. Sin is disgusting. So of course Paul says, I'm a miserable human being. Who will deliver me from this dead person? And because the answer is such good news, he can't resist giving us a peek. He says, thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So he's looking ahead to chapter 8 because he can't wait for one more verse where he sums himself up. So he says, in summary, so then I'm a slave to God's law in my mind, but I'm a slave to sin's law in my body. But he tipped his hand. He told us what he's going to talk about in chapter 6. He's going to talk about how we get rid of that body of death, how we deal with it. So, what do we do with this? Well, the first thing we do is we come back next week because it's such good news that Paul couldn't resist kind of giving us a sneak peek there. So the first application is just come back next week. And if you can't come back next week, then read chapter 8 as soon as you can, because that is where the good news really lies. But there's something else we can do. We can appreciate that we don't know how miserable someone else is. That we can see what they do. We can see the way they behave. But we don't know how miserable they are. We don't know what kind of dead corpse they have inside them. We don't know what kind of weight they're carrying. So we can have understanding. Maybe the circumstances of our life are such that we can actually help them in some way. But even if we can't, even if we've got our own corpse we're carrying around, maybe we can at least understand them and have some appreciation. I don't understand what they're dealing with. So we can be understanding. We can realize we don't know how miserable someone is. But there's another thought. Because some of you may be saying, yeah, that's not me, I'm sorry. I don't have that kind of problem, You know, there's some areas where I kind of don't behave as well as I'd like, but I'm basically a pretty good Christian, and I don't, that whole metaphor, Paul, you're just too dramatic. It's not that bad. No, I'm not there. Well, maybe so. Maybe you just kind of sail from victory to victory, that you have no appreciable amount of sin in your life. Maybe so. I wish I could say that. I wish I could say that, no, I live in victory. But that's not my experience. And I would ask you, are you really a better Christian than the Apostle Paul? Are you holier than St. Augustine and Luther and Calvin? Because maybe what you're doing is setting the bar too low. Are your victories too frequent or too easy? C.S. Lewis says in his book, Mere Christianity, he talks about this and he says, no one knows how bad he is until he's tried very hard to be good. After all, you find out the strength of the wind by trying to walk against it, not by lying down. This is why bad people, in one sense, know very little about badness. They've lived a sheltered life by always giving in. We never know the strength of the evil impulse inside us until we try to fight it. So, what do we do? Well, maybe we should risk a little more. Maybe we should say, look, every time I've tried to deal with that, it's been a failure. It's been a colossal belly flop, and I feel like an idiot. And Paul is telling us, well, why don't you try again? Why don't you try again? Because the only way you can guarantee failure is by giving into it. And who knows? This might be the time. Maybe you'll have some success. Maybe you will have a victory this time. But you certainly won't have a victory if you give in. I think This is the reason why Christians are so indistinguishable from non-Christians in our culture, because we give in. We say, you know what, there's really nothing I can do about that. I'm just kind of that way. I've always failed in the past. God may be calling us as individuals and as the community of faith to risk a little more, to say, okay, you know, this is on God. If I have a belly flop, that's okay. I've been set right with God. Jesus has already taken care of that. I can fail knowing that I'm okay with my Savior. And I can try and maybe fail to live just a little bit differently. Last week we talked about the way that this is a hard thing to remember because the failures are so in your face. It's hard to remember. And so Jesus gave us a sacrament called baptism to remember what he has done, a tangible sign of what he has done spiritually in uniting us to him. And he gave us another sign. He gave us another sign to help us to remember that he is here with us, that he is aware of our struggles and he is available to us in our time of need. So I invite you to join us at the table of the Lord's Supper to receive the gift that he offers us there.